I didn't plan to kiss him. I didn't even know his name. All I knew was that my ex was standing 10 feet away, smiling like he'd already replaced me. And I refused to walk out of that bar looking small. So I grabbed the nearest stranger and kissed him. What I didn't know was this. The man I kissed wasn't just a stranger, he would become my boss. The most powerful man in the building. And the one person who could ruin my career, or protect it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing. He remembered everything. Every second. Every look. Every lie I told myself that night, and when I walked into work the next morning. And saw him standing at the front of the room. I knew my life had already changed. This is how it started. The golden lights inside the velvet room were meant to feel luxurious. Tonight, they felt like a trap. Lena Carter stood frozen just inside the doorway, her pulse thundering in her ears as soft jazz drifted through the crowded bar. Her phone vibrated again in her hand. He's here. With her. Please don't do anything reckless. Too late. Across the room, tucked into a shadowed booth, sat Ethan Brooks, the man she had loved for nearly 3 years. His arm was draped casually along the back of the seat. And pressed against his side was the woman he'd sworn was just a coworker. Her manicured fingers rested on his thigh. His laughter was low, intimate. Familiar, there was no misunderstanding. No explanation left. The realization hit Lena like ice water to the chest. Her breath caught, sharp and painful, and for a moment she couldn't move. She felt exposed, humiliated, like everyone in the room could see her heart breaking in real time. Then the pain shifted. It hardened. She walked toward them. Ethan. Her voice surprised even herself, steady, controlled. He looked up, annoyance flashing across his face before guilt even had time to appear. Lena? What are you doing here? She glanced at the woman beside him, who suddenly looked very uncomfortable. I could ask you the same. Ethan exhaled impatiently, running a hand through his perfect hair. Can we not do this here? She let out a bitter laugh. Do what? Catch you cheating? In public? With half our social circle watching? He stood, his expression sharpening. Fine. You want honesty? His eyes were cold now. I needed something more exciting. Someone on my level. The words landed like a slap. You're safe, Lena. Predictable. Comfortable. He gestured toward the woman beside him. She's different. The humiliation burned hotter than the betrayal. Tears stung her eyes, not from sadness, but rage. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to beg. Her gaze drifted past him and stopped. At the bar sat a man who didn't belong to the noise. Tall. Impeccably dressed. Still. His presence alone seemed to command the space around him. Dark eyes. Sharp jaw. Power radiating from silence. Without another thought, Lena turned away from Ethan. She crossed the room, stopped in front of the stranger, and before he could speak, she grabbed his jacket and kissed him hard. It wasn't gentle. It was reckless. Furious. Final. For a heartbeat, the man stiffened, then his hand settled at her waist, firm and controlled, pulling her closer. When she pulled back, her lips were tingling, her breath uneven. She turned. Ethan stared in stunned disbelief. Looks like we both wanted something new, Lena said calmly. Then she walked out. She didn't look back. She didn't know the man's name. She didn't know she'd just kissed her future. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it again. The weight of his hand at my waist. The shock of control beneath that calm exterior. The way he hadn't pushed me away. I told myself it meant nothing. It was a reckless moment. A stranger. A bad decision fueled by humiliation and anger. By morning, I was back in reality. Late rent. A demanding job. A promotion I'd been chasing for months. Men who sat quietly at bars didn't belong in my life. Or so I thought. When I arrived at work the next day, the office buzzed with unusual energy. People whispered in clusters. My manager looked nervous, which never happened. Conference room. Now, she said. I followed, confused, my stomach tightening with every step. Inside, the entire department was already seated. At the head of the table stood a man in a tailored suit, posture relaxed, presence commanding, stopped cold. It was him. The stranger from the bar. Clean-shaven. Sharper somehow. Colder. And absolutely not surprised to see me. This is Mr. Julian Blackwood, my manager announced. Our new CEO. The room erupted in polite applause. I felt my blood drain from my face. CEO. My mind screamed run, but my feet were frozen to the floor. Julian's gaze met mine, steady, unreadable, and just for a fraction of a second, something flickered there, recognition. Then it vanished. Good morning, he said calmly. I look forward to working with all of you. Working. With. Me. The meeting dragged on, every word blurring together. I stared at the table, praying he wouldn't say my name. He didn't. That somehow made it worse. Afterward, as people filed out, I tried to disappear with them. Miss Carter, Julian said behind me. My heart slammed. I turned slowly. Yes, sir? His eyes searched my face, cool and deliberate. Close the door. The click echoed like a verdict. I assume, he said evenly, you don't make a habit of kissing strangers. Heat rushed to my face. I didn't know who you were. No, he agreed. You didn't. Silence stretched. Last night was unexpected, he continued. But it won't happen again. Relief washed through me until he added. However, he said, stepping closer, we need to set boundaries. Clear ones. I nodded quickly. Of course. I understand. His gaze lingered. Good, he said. Because from this moment on, your career depends on discretion. My chest tightened. This job means everything to me, I said. A pause. That, Julian replied quietly, is exactly why you should be careful around me. As he opened the door, I realized something terrifying. The kiss I thought would end one chapter of my life had just opened another. And this one came with power, rules, and consequences I couldn't yet see. Julian kept his distance. That was the first thing I noticed. No looks held too long. No private conversations. No reminders of the kiss that still burned in my memory. At work, he treated me like I was invisible. Which, somehow, was worse. Meetings passed where my ideas were acknowledged, but never credited. Emails were answered with single-line responses. Professional. Cold. Untouchable. I told myself this was good, safe. Exactly what I wanted. Until Ethan showed up again. He was waiting outside the office building when I left late one evening, leaning against his car like he still belonged in my life. You've been ignoring my calls, he said. I've been busy, I replied flatly. He smirked. With your new boss? My stomach tightened. Don't start. I heard about him, Ethan continued. Julian Blackwood. Powerful. Untouchable. You really think someone like that sees you as anything more than a distraction? The words cut deeper than I expected. I'm not your concern anymore, I said, stepping around him. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Office. Now. No signature. I didn't need one. Julian stood by the window when I entered, city lights reflecting off the glass behind him. Ethan Brooks, he said without turning. You should stay away from him. My heart skipped. You looked into my personal life? I protect my company, he replied calmly. And my employees. That didn't sound like concern, I said. He turned then, eyes sharp. It was a warning. Silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we refused to say. You think last night meant nothing, I said finally. I think, Julian answered, voice low, that mixing emotions and power destroys people. Then why do you look like you're already losing control? I asked. The question hung in the air. For a moment, the mask slipped. Then it was back. You should go, he said. As I left, my phone buzzed again. This time, a different number. I made a mistake. Let me explain. Ethan. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Because suddenly, I wasn't just caught between a cheating ex and a powerful boss. I was standing at the edge of something dangerous. Where silence was a weapon. And every choice I made would cost me something. The message from Ethan stayed unread. Not because I didn't care, but because something else felt wrong. The next morning, my access badge didn't work. I stood outside the office gate, swiping it again and again while people streamed past me. Finally, security checked the system. Your clearance was temporarily restricted, he said. Management decision. My stomach dropped. An hour later, my manager called me in. Don't panic, she said quickly. This isn't disciplinary. Mr. Blackwood personally requested the review. Personally. I walked back to my desk feeling every stare sharpen. Whispers followed me like shadows. At noon, Julian finally summoned me. This time, the door was already closed. You should have told me Ethan contacted you, he said, skipping pleasantries. My chest tightened. How did you? He's been asking questions, Julian cut in. About you. About this company. Why would he do that? Julian studied me carefully. Because he thinks you're a shortcut. To what? I asked. To me. The word landed heavier than I expected. You're assuming a lot, I said quietly. No, Julian replied. I'm stating a pattern. He walked to his desk and slid a file toward me. Photos. Messages. Timestamps. Ethan meeting with people I didn't recognize. Phone calls made minutes after our breakup. Conversations that had nothing to do with reconciliation. He didn't come back because he missed you, Julian said. He came back because he realized who you're connected to. My hands trembled as I closed the file. So what now? I asked. Now, Julian said calmly, you stop responding. You don't meet him. You don't explain anything. And if I don't? I challenged. His gaze hardened. Then you become a liability. The word stung. I stood up. I didn't ask for this. No, he agreed. But it found you anyway. That evening, I spotted Ethan again, this time across the street from my apartment. Watching. When I turned toward him, he smiled and lifted his phone. I didn't smile back. I went inside, locked the door, and leaned against it, heart racing. My phone buzzed. You should let me help you. Julian. I stared at the screen, realizing something chilling. The kiss that started as revenge had turned me into a target, and the only person who seemed to understand how dangerous that was the man I was supposed to stay far away from. I didn't reply to Julian's message right away. Not because I didn't trust him, but because replying meant admitting something I wasn't ready to face, that I was scared. The next morning, Ethan cornered me before I reached my car. You've been avoiding me, he said, flashing that familiar smile like it still worked. Move, I replied. Relax, he said, lowering his voice. I'm just worried about you. This company, your boss, people are talking. I laughed without humor. You suddenly care about my safety? His eyes flickered. Just for a second. I care about opportunities, he said. And you're standing next to a very big one. There it was. I stepped closer, keeping my voice steady. Stay away from me. Or what? He smirked. You'll complain to your CEO boyfriend? The words made my stomach twist. That afternoon, Julian called me into his office again. This time, there were no files on the desk. No warnings. Just honesty. Ethan is feeding information to a competitor, he said. They're probing for weaknesses. And I'm the weakness, I replied. You're the access point, Julian corrected. There's a difference. Silence settled between us. I can move you to another department, he continued. Lower visibility. Less risk. And my career? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. That depends, he said slowly, on whether you trust me. I met his gaze. You never told me why you kissed me back. The question surprised him. Because you didn't look like someone who needed saving, he said. You looked like someone who'd already decided not to beg. My throat tightened. I won't be your weakness, I said. And I won't be your excuse. Julian nodded once. Then stand with me. That night, I blocked Ethan's number. It felt final. Terrifying. Liberating, and as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, I understood the truth I'd been avoiding. The moment I kissed a stranger to protect my pride, I stepped into a world where power notices you. And once it does, you don't get to pretend you're invisible anymore. The first time I realized I was being followed, I told myself I was paranoid. Same car. Same distance. 3 turns in a row. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were shaking. I didn't look back. I didn't run. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, locking it behind me as quietly as possible. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Julian, are you home? My heart dropped. How did he know? Me, yes. 3 dots appeared. Then. Julian, don't open the door for anyone tonight. I'm on my way. I didn't ask questions. 10 minutes later, a knock echoed through the apartment. Not Julian's. Firm. Deliberate. I froze, the handle rattled once, testing. Then a voice I knew too well. Lena, Ethan called softly. I just want to talk. I backed away, my pulse roaring in my ears. I know you're in there, he continued. You don't need to be scared. I'm trying to help you. Help. The word sounded wrong coming from him, then his tone changed. You really think Julian Blackwood cares about you, he said. To him, you're leverage. Nothing more. Anger cut through the fear. I said leave, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Silence. Then footsteps retreating. Moments later, headlights swept across my window. Julian arrived less than 5 minutes after that. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask if I was okay. He checked the locks. The windows. The hallway camera feed on his phone. He crossed a line, Julian said quietly. This can't continue. You knew this would happen, I said. Yes, he admitted. But not this fast. I hugged my arms around myself. What happens now? He met my gaze, expression hard but honest. Now you stop reacting, he said. And start protecting yourself. How? He took out his phone and typed quickly. By learning, he continued, how people like Ethan exploit access. I stared at him. You want to use me? No, Julian said firmly. I want to teach you how not to be used. The distinction mattered more than I expected. That night, I didn't sleep. But for the first time since this began, I wasn't just afraid, I was angry. Because fear makes you hide. But anger? Anger makes you pay attention. And I was done being caught off guard. I stopped being afraid of Ethan. That was the first change. Fear had kept me reactive, jumping at every message, every shadow, every unexpected sound. But once I understood what he wanted, the fear turned into clarity. He didn't want me. He wanted access. Julian didn't tell me what to do. He showed me how people like Ethan think. They rush when they believe time is running out, Julian said. And they overpromise when they think they're close. So I let Ethan believe he was close. I didn't unblock his number. I used a new one. We need to talk, I texted. I can't do this over messages. The reply came almost instantly. I knew you'd come around. We met in a crowded cafe near the financial district. Public. Loud. Cameras everywhere. Ethan arrived confident, relaxed, too relaxed. I'm glad you finally realized I'm on your side, he said, leaning back. I realized I don't know the whole story, I replied. And I'm tired of being kept in the dark. He smiled. That's because Julian likes control. He doesn't trust you. And you do? I asked. Of course, Ethan said smoothly. I just need to know what he's planning next. His acquisitions. His investors. Anything he's hiding. There it was. I took a slow breath. Why? Because people are nervous, he said. And nervous people pay well. I nodded, pretending to hesitate. What if I could get you something? I asked quietly. But it would take time. Ethan leaned forward, interest sharpening his gaze. Then take all the time you need, he said. Just don't shut me out again. I left the cafe with my heart racing, but my hands steady. That night, I told Julian everything. He took the bait, Julian said calmly. Good. You're not angry? I asked. He shook his head. You did exactly what needed to be done. A week later, Ethan messaged again. Any luck? I sent him a single file. Harmless on its own. Useless without context. But convincing. Within hours, Julian's team saw the movement, accounts shifting. Calls made too fast. A competitor stepping where they shouldn't. Ethan had handed himself over. The next morning, security escorted him out of a downtown office building. Fraud. Breach of contract. Conspiracy. I watched the news in silence. Julian stood beside me, not touching, not crowding. You okay? He asked. Yes, I said honestly. Because for the first time, the story wasn't happening to me. I was shaping it. And I realized something powerful. The moment you stop being afraid of losing someone who already betrayed you, they lose every hold they ever had. Ethan's arrest didn't make headlines. Not the way people expect. There were no cameras chasing him down the street, no dramatic courtroom scenes splashed across the news. Just a brief article buried under market updates and corporate announcements. Former consultant detained amid corporate investigation, that was all. But for me, it felt like silence after a storm. Julian handled the fallout with precision. Legal teams moved quietly. Security tightened. Meetings resumed as if nothing had happened. And slowly, the tension loosened its grip on my chest. One evening, weeks later, Julian and I stood on the rooftop terrace of the building, the city stretching endlessly below us. You don't need to stay, he said. Not here. Not with the company. I know, I replied. He studied me. What will you do? I'll take the promotion I earned, I said. At a different branch. One where I don't have to look over my shoulder. A pause. And us? He asked. I met his gaze, steady. What happened between us started with anger, I said. And power. That's not a foundation I can stand on. He nodded slowly, accepting the truth without trying to bend it. You changed things, he said quietly. You saw through people I've spent years managing. And you taught me how not to disappear, I replied. We stood there for a moment, either reaching for the other. There was no kiss goodbye. There didn't need to be. Months later, my life was calmer. Smaller, maybe, but honest. I focused on work. On friendships I'd neglected. On trusting myself again. Sometimes, I thought about that night at the bar. The humiliation. The impulse. The stranger I kissed to prove I was still worth choosing. I don't regret it, because that kiss didn't give me a new man. It gave me something better. A spine. I learned that revenge fades, power shifts, and people reveal themselves when they think they're winning. But the moment you stop trying to be chosen, you start choosing yourself. And that was the ending I needed.